Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are continuing our study of the feast days of Israel. Now, I promised you, and I'm going to keep my word, I'm going to have to, and in doing it, I realize I'm going to be passing over an unbelievable amount of information. But I'm not going to do this as a 5-year study. I'm going to try to give highlights. I want to look at the pertinent arguments that are made both for and against. And let me say this. I'm currently examining the doctrine of the Sabbaths, not just one day, but the Sabbaths plural. Okay? If there is some aspect of the study of the Sabbaths plural, or the Sabbath, that you would like for me to examine as we are studying the Sabbaths, then let me know. Send me an email. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and hit the contact. Send me an email, or in the comment section here on YouTube, or Facebook for that matter. Say, Don, I don't think you covered this aspect of the Sabbath enough. So if you would, please do one video or whatever on it and cover this particular aspect of the subject of the Sabbath. While I don't want to drag the study on and on and on and on, I most assuredly want to hit the most pertinent, the most important. And so feel free to make your suggestions. If you think I haven't responded to something properly, then remind me of it, all right? And I'll do my best to discuss it. Now, when we talk about the Sabbaths, we have to understand, as I pointed out yesterday, each and every one of the Sabbaths was a convocation. As I noted, the word convocation, you just look it up on Google, on AI or whatever it is you use. Convocation means a rehearsal. Israel knew, certainly the scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers, the rabbis, understood that Israel's history was typological. Now, let me give you just a couple of real brief examples of this, because it's not only what the rabbis taught, it's what the New Testament teaches. The rabbis taught, for instance, in regard to Passover, as redemption came on the Passover the first time, our final salvation, redemption, will come through Messiah on Passover. Well, guess when the Lord Jesus partook of the Passover and said, as he took the cup, there were actually 4 cups, in some traditions 5, but nonetheless, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sin. First Passover, the rabbis said, our redemption came the first time on Passover. The final redemption will come on the second time on Passover. They said such things as it was in the days of Moses, a 40 years for salvation and deliverance from bondage, so it will be in the days of Messiah. And guess what, folks? That correlates directly to the period of the millennium. And so what I'm suggesting is, not only does the word convocation point us to the fact that the feast days, but not just the feast days, ladies and gentlemen, Israel's history was typological. And this is so incredibly important. J. Ross Wagner, in his marvelous book, Heralds of the Good News, points out how the New Testament writers quote from the Psalms over and over and over again and apply the Psalms Christologically to Jesus. And yet he says, in rabbinic history, the Psalms were never really viewed that way. So here's an example in which the ancient rabbis kind of looked at the Psalms and did a little bit of a Passover, excuse the pun, in their discussions of the Psalms. Now, that doesn't say that they didn't believe other events in their history were typological. No, it doesn't suggest that at all. But it points out that the New Testament writers were viewing the Old Testament typologically as a foreshadowing of Christ. As Wagner points out in Psalm 68, Psalms 34. Now, that's just two tiny little examples, all right, of a vast number of Old Testament passages and from the Psalms that the New Testament writers quote. And as Wagner points out, the New Testament writers, specifically Paul, quotes from Psalms 34, Psalm 68, 69, to speak of the suffering servant, suffering servants plural, and these are imprecatory psalms calling on God to avenge his righteous saints. Well, Paul quotes these psalms as typological and as predictive. That's what types and shadows were. They were predictive of the coming vindication of the martyrs in the first century. He does this in Romans chapter 11. Let their table become a snare, O Lord. And Paul kind of joins together Psalms 69 and Psalms 34. So what's the point here? When we look at the Old Testament and we see how why the feasts were given, they were given and pointed forward to the better things coming of Messiah. And as I stated, the New Testament teaches this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in verse 6 and in verse 11 as well, Paul cites several Old Testament stories, narratives, true stories of Israel in the wilderness, how they murmured, how they turned to adultery, etc., and how God judged them for their sin. And he says, verse 6, those things happened as types. Verse 11, again, reciting the same things. These things happened unto them. Now, unfortunately, the King James and other translations render this as examples for us. Sorry, folks, that's a bad translation. Scholars such as Davidson write on and on. They all point out that the Greek of the text is they were tupoi, types of us, upon whom the ends of the ages is come. Now, what's he saying? He's saying that Old Testament Israel's events were types and shadows, and he says, of us. That's his first century generation. And those types and shadows pointed not only to the first century generation, but Paul says, us upon whom the ends of the ages has come. So he's referring to those past times, the past ages, the past times, and what those past times pointed to, what those past times events typified, and he says, the goal of all of those previous ages has arrived. Folks, do you catch the power of this? This is absolutely incredible. Why is it so important? It's so important because You and I are told by amillennialists, postmillennialists, premillennialists, we're still waiting for the goal of all the ages to arrive. You know what that means? We're still waiting for the types and the shadows and for the convocations of Israel's feast days to be fulfilled, to be realized. Well, wait a minute. All three futurist views tell us, oh, well, the law of Moses has been completely fulfilled and has passed away. But the law of Moses is the law that contained the convocations. It's the law that contained the feast days as convocations, as types and shadows of the coming better things. So the events and mandates under the law of Moses anticipated, foreshadowed, typified, rehearsed the good things that were about to come. And what did they foreshadow? Final rest, final salvation. Our redemption came first time at Passover, second time on Passover. We'll get more to that. So here's Paul saying, all of those types, all of those shadows, all of those convocations pointed to his us, upon whom the ends, the goal of all of those convocations, the goal of all of those types, the goal of all of those shadows. And he said, they have come upon us. Paul was saying that appointed time that those shadows and types and convocations pointed to, that appointed time had arrived. The Greek word katentao. And its destiny arrived, or goal arrived. That's telos, katentao. Folks, this is absolutely incredible. So when we understand the shadow nature of the feast days, when we understand the shadow form of the Sabbath, and we see Paul saying that what all of those things, Paul didn't exclude anything. Paul didn't say, now, some of the feast days foreshadowed this, some of the feast days foreshadowed that, some of the Sabbaths were types and shadows of this, while others were types and shadows of this. Nope. The Sabbaths, Sabbaton, were all shadows of the good things. Now notice what Paul does, especially in light of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. When Paul wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he said the time has arrived. The goal of the ages. What all those types and shadows foreshadowed. The time has arrived. And then in Colossians chapter 2, he says, those new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, and what they foreshadowed the good things, quote, about to come. You know what that means? That means that whatever the seventh day Sabbath foreshadowed, it was about to be fulfilled. Whatever Passover, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Pentecost, those had already been fulfilled, ladies and gentlemen, because Christ was the Passover. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 5 and 6. We're not still waiting for another Passover lamb, are we? So it's really interesting and significant that Paul in Colossians chapter 2 says, new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are, present tense, a shadow of the good things about to come. So, when he mentions the new moons, he's singling out Yom Teruah. He's singling out the eschatological feasts. But he said, the fulfillment of those foreshadows. The fulfillment of those Sabbaths was about to come. Folks, we're not waiting for the fulfillment of the shadows of the old covenant. We're not waiting for the fulfillment of the Sabbath. And naturally, we've got more. I'll see you on the flip side.